So, you ever feel like you're just wading through this constant wave of news
Oh,
and
absolutely.
you're trying to figure out, okay, what's really important here? What are the stories that, are going to have those ripple effects later on?
Yeah, that feeling of overload is it's definitely real.
Yeah.
And it's easy to miss some of the bigger currents, the things happening underneath the surface.
Well, that's exactly what we want to try and do today. This deep dive, it's really about trying to cut through some of that noise.
Okay.
We're focusing on something pretty significant, election integrity and, well, the role of money in
A
politics.
huge topic.
It is, and we're using insights from a source one of you shared with us. It's a YouTube video transcript from Midas Touch.
Ah, okay, Midas Touch.
All right.
Right. And this transcript that looks at these alleged efforts to sort of weaken the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC,
Exactly.
and it connects that to these, much broader questions about fairness in our elections. It's a really interesting look at how these like seemingly technical changes can have massive consequences.
Totally. So today we're going to try and unpack a few key things. We'll kick things off with some recent comments from Donald Trump about the Constitution, specifically around election results.
Okay, yeah, I saw that reference.
Then we'll step back a bit, look at the history, campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, the big one, Citizens United.
The historical context is crucial there.
Definitely. Then we'll get into the FEC itself, like what's its current state, what happens when its capacity is, well, diminished.
And the oversight issues that
Yeah.
creates.
And we'll look at some specific examples too, right? Big money in recent elections, the source mentions Elon Musk, this thing called the RBG pack.
Right, those concrete examples really illustrate the point.
And then finally, we'll touch on some of the bigger worries raised in the source. This idea of a potential shift towards, I think they call it an oligarch king authoritarian system.
Yeah, that's pretty strong language, but it reflects the level of concern in the source material about where things might be heading.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. These comments from Donald Trump, the clip we're looking at, he seems to suggest that he might not need to uphold the Constitution as president, especially regarding election numbers he doesn't agree with.
Yes, that's the statement. It definitely raises some eyebrows. He talks about relying on his lawyers, their interpretation of Supreme Court rulings.
Right.
And that immediately brings up these, well, fundamental questions about rule of law, separation of powers, especially around elections.
It really does. It feels like it's challenging some core ideas, and it actually leads us pretty naturally into the history, doesn't it?
It does.
To understand how we got to this point, we kind of need to look at past attempts to regulate money in politics. The transcript highlights McCain-Feingold back in 2002. What was the main idea there?
Well, McCain-Feingold, it was genuinely bipartisan.
Yeah.
You had Republican Senator John McCain, Democratic Senator Russ Feingold pushing it.
Right.
And the goal, primarily, was to limit the influence of what they called dark money. Money where you don't know the source.
Untraceable stuff.
Yeah, and to sort of curb the power of corporations and really wealthy individuals to potentially skew elections, trying to level a playing field, reduce the appearance or reality of corruption.
And it's interesting, the transcript mentions Senator McCain himself, I think it was a 2007 Fox News interview, saying the law hadn't really been fully implemented.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he apparently called out these 527 groups as a disgrace that needed to go because they were undermining the law's intent.
Wow. So even one of the architects felt it wasn't enough or was being bypassed.
Exactly. It shows this was a real concern across the aisle back then.
Absolutely. There was a shared sense that just unlimited, unchecked money could really erode public trust. But then, well, the whole landscape just shifted massively in 2010.
Right. Citizens United, that Supreme Court decision, still feels like we're dealing with the fallout from that one. Can you break down what that ruling did?
Okay, so Citizens United v. FEC. The core of it was the Supreme Court saying that corporations, unions, and these other outside groups, including the dark money groups we talked about, they have a First Amendment free speech right to spend unlimited amounts of money in elections.
So spending money equals speech.
In this context, essentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The court equated political spending by these entities with protected speech.
And like the transcript points out, lots of people warned at the time, didn't they? They said this would just open the floodgates.
They did.
Hidden influence, potential manipulation, letting people with, really deep pockets just dominate the conversation. undoing what McCain-Feingold tried to do.
Yeah, those warnings seem pretty prescient now looking back. And if you look at the 2024 cycle, the transcript gives some concrete examples. It mentions Elon Musk's spending.
Yeah, huge amounts, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions, the source says, poured into the 2024 elections. That's just enormous influence for one person.
It really is. And the transcript also brings up this RPG pack,
Oh, yeah. That was weird.
allegedly running these kind of deceptive ads, trying to link Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Donald Trump.
Which makes no logical sense.
Right. It just shows how big money can be used to, well, potentially confuse or mislead voters in ways that aren't very transparent. It almost feels like satire, doesn't it?
It really does. Just baffling. Unless the goal is just pure confusion.
Yeah.
And then there was Musk's other thing, that $1 million giveaway.
Oh, right. Tied to signing petitions and voting.
Yeah, the transcript mentions a woman in Wisconsin, Ekaterina Disler, who claimed she got $1 million for doing that. And she was even in ads about it.
That's right. That definitely generated buzz. But it also raises these questions about, is it okay to use direct financial incentives like that to influence political participation?
Yeah, where's the line?
Exactly. Though, interestingly, the source does say that tactics seemed less successful in a Wisconsin judicial race. Maybe voters look at different races differently.
Maybe. Could be. But these examples, they really got home the impact of Citizens United. But, like you said, the money is only one part of it. The transcript really digs into the weakening of the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC. What was the FEC originally supposed to do?
Okay, so the FEC came about after Watergate. Big scandal, obviously.
Right. Trust in government was low.
Exactly. So the goal was explicitly bipartisan, fight corruption, restore some faith. And the structure was key. It was designed for consensus.
So,
3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. And crucially, you needed 4 votes to do anything significant, enforce rules, issue opinions, investigations.
okay. So no one party could just run the show.
Precisely. The idea was to force agreement,
Yeah.
prevent it from becoming just another political tool. It had to be somewhat impartial to function as intended.
So that bipartisan structure was really fundamental, but the transcript alleges that Donald Trump actively worked to undermine that. How did that supposedly happen?
Well, the source mentions the reported removal of a commissioner, Commissioner Winter, described as someone really pushing for fair processes.
Okay.
And then, after that, several Republican commissioners apparently resigned, which meant...
Not enough people left for a quorum.
Exactly. They fell below the minimum number needed to actually conduct official business.
So what does that mean in practice if the FEC can't conduct business?
It means it's effectively sidelined. It can't properly investigate complaints about campaign finance laws being broken. It can't issue those advisory opinions that campaigns rely on for guidance. It can't really enforce the rules.
So the referee is kind of off the field.
That's a good way to put it. Its ability to actually, blow the whistle when rules are broken is severely hampered, if not gone entirely, for certain actions.
And Tiffany Mueller from End Citizens United, who's quoted in the transcript, she connects this directly back to Citizens United, right?
She does. She draws a straight line. Her argument, basically, is that the Citizens United decision created this flood of money and complex new issues.
That the FEC, in its weakened state, is now totally unequipped to handle.
Exactly. The problems got bigger, just as the agency meant to deal with them got smaller, or rather, less functional.
And Mueller makes another point, doesn't she? About access and influence.
Yeah, she talks about the sort of unprecedented access and influence that big donors and spenders now have.
Because of the sheer amount of money involved.
Right. And she suggests this can lead to a system where, well, the priorities of those wealthy donors get put ahead of everyday Americans. And potentially, it could even open the door to self-enrichment for those in power.
And she compares the U.S. system to other democracies.
She does. She points out that lots of other places, like Canada, countries in Europe, they have election bodies that are designed to be much less political.
More insulated from the partisan back and forth.
Exactly. Less subject to the kind of political maneuvering that seems to have impacted the FEC.
It does make you wonder if our system has become maybe uniquely vulnerable to these kinds of pressures, either by design or just recent events.
That's a fair question.
So, okay, let's connect the dots then, based on the source. You've got this surge of money, a lot of it untraceable, after Citizens United. And then you have a weakened, basically non-functional FEC. What are the big picture implications for democracy, according to this transcript?
Well, the core argument is pretty stark. It's that this lack of transparency in who is funding campaigns, made worse by Citizens United and then kind of enabled by a neutered FEC, is fundamentally undermining election integrity.
And they had that statistic, didn't they, about the amount of non-transparent money?
Yeah, that was striking. Approximately 75% of the money in the 2024 cycle lacked full transparency about its origin.
75%. That's huge.
It is. And that figure, it represents a pretty significant jump from earlier cycles, like, say, 2012, where analyses suggested maybe closer to half lacked full disclosure. So the trend is definitely towards less transparency.
Which means for most of the money influencing elections, the public has no idea where it's coming from.
Pretty much. And that lack of clarity, well, it creates openings. Potential for more corporate influence, foreign money, maybe even foreign government money, to seep into the system without us knowing who's behind it or what they want.
And the transcript gave that example about climate change legislation.
Yes, that was a powerful example. Before Citizens United, reportedly, there were like 14 times Senate Republicans joined Democrats on climate bills.
Okay.
After Citizens United and the alleged ramp up in spending by big oil and gas, that number dropped to 0.
0? Wow.
That's a pretty dramatic shift, isn't it? And the source suggests this isn't just climate change.
Right, it affects other big policy areas too.
Yeah, things like prescription drug prices, gun violence, reproductive rights, areas where big money interests can potentially block or heavily shape what laws get passed or don't get passed.
And there was that comparison to the Supreme Court's absolute immunity ruling as well.
Yeah, the parallel they draw is about unchecked power. The concern is that just like, critics worried absolute immunity could lead to abuses of executive power.
The unchecked flow of money in politics, especially after Citizens United and with a weak FEC, has led to the very problems people warned about back then.
That seems to be the argument presented, yes. That the warnings were ignored, and now we're seeing the consequences.
And this all circles back to that ultimate worry mentioned in the source, this potential slide towards an oligarch king authoritarian system.
Right. That's the endpoint they're concerned about. The argument is if you weaken the guardrails, the rules around money and elections, you risk concentrating power too much in the hands of the wealthy few.
A really serious warning. But okay, the transcript doesn't just paint a bleak picture, does it? It mentions some efforts to push back, at least from the perspective of the source group and Citizens United.
That's true. It does talk about what they're trying to do.
What are those main areas?
They mention 3 things and Citizens United is focusing on. First, electoral work, trying to win back the House in 2026 is mentioned.
Okay, political action.
Second, legislative efforts pushing for reforms to campaign finance laws, both federally and at the state level. And third, just raising public awareness about corruption in politics.
And they also stressed winning specific state-level offices, right?
Yes, big emphasis on that. Winning key constitutional offices, governor, secretary of state, attorney general, especially in battleground states.
Why those offices specifically?
Because those are often the officials who actually administer elections, oversee the process, and crucially, certify the results.
Okay. So controlling the mechanics of the election.
That seems to be the focus. They specifically mentioned the 2022 Michigan Secretary of State race as an example of why these races are so important.
Makes sense. And the source ends with a call for basically people power.
Yeah, collective action, people raising their voices against corruption. And it gives the contact info for End Citizens United if listeners want to learn more.
Which was endcitizenunited.org, and on Blue Sky, it's at endcitizensunited.org.
Right. So, yeah, looking back at everything we've covered, it's clear these things are all connected, isn't it?
Definitely. Campaign finance rules, Supreme Court rulings, how agencies like the FEC actually function. It all ties directly into the health and integrity of our elections.
It's complex stuff, and maybe not always front-page news day to day.
Yeah, it's not always the flashiest story. But understanding these sort of underlying mechanics feels absolutely essential if you care about how our democracy works.
Agreed. So maybe a final thought here for you, the listener, to chew on.
Okay.
We've talked about the history, where things stand now according to the source, some of the proposed fixes from that perspective. But thinking beyond just what we discussed, what specific actions or reforms do you think are most critical now to really safeguard fair, transparent elections going forward?
That's a good question.
Yeah, something to really mull over after this deep dive wraps up. What did that path forward look like from your perspective?